I'm wrong. So I want to make sure I answer any questions you might have about me or whatever, the Sheriff's Department, public safety, or my candidacy, whatever it might be. So the question I get asked often is why I'm choosing to run for Congress, and I can tell you that if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, it would have been the furthest thing from my mind. I have things pretty good where I am. I've been with the Sheriff's Department since 1989, started as a deputy, went through all the ranks, ran for sheriff as a captain. Ran in 2010, very tight, very close election. I was unopposed in 2014, was re-elected for the first time in 34 years, it was unopposed that office. And so for the first couple of years, I've given it back. There's a lot of work, a lot of time. I mean, the decisions that I make and the department makes affects 1.5 million people. So it's pretty weighty. But now I enjoy the job. I can see why people stay. You know, I get longer stays for 4 or 5 terms, although that wouldn't be me, regardless of what happens. So, so like I said, I have things pretty good. So if you asked me a couple years ago, that have been the furthest thing from my mind. But I can tell you in October of 2014, and you remember this incident, we had an officer killed, Danny Oliver. And the same day, the same person killed Mike Davis, Detective Mike Davis up in Tyson County, shot a 3rd officer, shot an innocent civilian in the face, had multiple carjackings. It was a whole day-long crime spree. We ultimately got him into custody. Found out that, and I found out that number one, he was in on a false name.
Please don't worry.
This is an intervention.
I do too.
That's awful. See, that's why I need him. Anyway, we didn't even know who this guy's true identity was. He was booked and had a driver's license under a false name out of Utah. And he'd been removed from the country on 4 prior occasions. Twice deported, twice simply released across the border the very same day. No repercussions, no consequences for being in the country illegally at any point during those 4 illegal removals. The 5th time, at least for the 5th time, he came back in. Fast forward to the events of October 24th, and he shot and killed Danny Oliver, who walked up to him and simply said, "Hey, how's it going today?" He was shot in the head, and that's what started that transaction. I knew I had to do something. I owed it to my department. I owed it to Danny Oliver's widow and Mike Davis's widow. And so what I decided to do was make a video plea to the president. So I sat behind my desk and I implored the president for meaningful immigration reform. And this was November of 2014. The video is still on YouTube. Some of you may have seen it. You can still Google it if you want to. I knew it would make news locally, and that was part of the issue. I wanted to create a discussion about immigration reform. At that point, I thought, frankly, I thought immigration reform was going to be the #1 topic throughout this campaign, not congressional, but throughout this presidential cycle. I thought immigration reform back then was going to be the #1 issue for folks on people's minds. I had no way of knowing it would go viral. It had been viewed millions and millions of times. I was on national news. I was on O'Reilly and Cavuto. I was in a studio in New York. I was on national and local radio talk shows all over the country. I was invited to speak in front of Congress twice. And that was really kind of a turning point for me because I was actually allowed to speak about what the administration was saying was going on and all the wonderful things they were doing to keep people safe. And I was actually able to testify about what was really happening on the street, how we weren't able to keep people safe. And that really started broadening my perspective. When I was sheriff, I mean, having a county-wide perspective is huge. And it was hard to wrap my head around, quite honestly. But then I started realizing that Sacramento County is just such a very small piece in this tapestry of And so about that time, I was being talked to by the NRCC, which is the National Republican Congressional Committee, the congressional wing of the National Republican Party, about running. They asked me if I would run, and I said, no, thank you. I'm not going to run. My wife's answer was much more colorful than mine about not running. I told them I had a job to do here. But as we went, and this was maybe the summer of last year, but as we were going through the summer and I started seeing what was going on with our country's, I'll say, unwillingness, because it's not an inability, but the unwillingness to address the threat that's facing us in terms of terrorism and homeland security and the threats that are facing us here, and the San Bernardino attack and the Paris attacks and everything in between, I realized that this president, this administration, has absolutely no concept of the threats that are facing us. By way of background, we're the host agency for the Regional Terrorism Threat Assessment Center here in this region. I sit as the chair of the Central California Intelligence Center. I'm the chair of that committee. I know what threats are here. I get briefed on these things all the time. I know what threats are here. And for a president to get up and blame the media for creating fear in people and to dismiss as rhetoric during a State of the Union address that our enemies are getting stronger and we're getting weaker. So it's just rhetoric. I would defy you to tell me one place in the world is safer today than it was 5 years ago. One place in the world. And that includes America. We are much more dangerous and we're continuing to go down the wrong path, and we are not safe, as we've seen just yet again last night in Nice in France, where I was a year ago. I was right on that walkway a year ago. Far enough removed to where I'm not to say it's a close call, but it certainly does have some sense of, my God, I was there. Same thing with Paris. I was there when they had, not there when they had it, but I was there last year when they had the attacks in Paris, so it means something. And for those of you that think that Nice is so far removed, that exact incident could happen. The only difference between that incident happening in Nice and something happening here is the language being spoken. Somebody could run a truck into a group of people right now, and there's nothing we can do about it, and we still aren't addressing the threat of terrorism. But I digress. I don't want to get all agitated. So that all sort of really started me even thinking about running for Congress. And it was a long discussion. I mean, I'm going to be gone. I would be gone from my family about 100 nights a year. I have 4 kids, 1 in college and 3 are still at home. It's a big sacrifice. I have to retire from the Sheriff's Department, take a hit on my pension over what I would normally get. My retirement wouldn't be fully insured yet. So it was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of discussion with the family and the kids. And as I say, the kids were, I brought the kids in the last part of the discussion. I say they're 110% on board. My wife's 100% on board, so she's got a little room for improvement. But nonetheless, everybody could get behind it. And so I had some concerns I brought to the NRCC about the campaign and what I saw in the last campaign when Doug Osee ran against Mr. Barrett. Things that I wanted to see different, and I got some assurances from them. I really kind of hoped someone would say no at some point along the line, to be honest with you. But no one did. So then it came down to me. I mean, honestly, when for this, everybody got on board that it was my decision, and that was the worst week of my life. And I decided, well, you know, this is a huge decision. And so I focused on 2 things. Number 1, I asked myself if I would regret it if I ran and didn't win. And the answer was no. I wouldn't regret it if I ran and didn't win. But would I regret it if I didn't run? And the answer just as quick was yes, that I would. That I'm in a position to do something. Not everybody can do something about it. I can. My background and experience, I can do something. I can go to Washington. I can make change, not just Homeland Security, but many things that are there. I mean, I lead a 2,000-person, $450 million, 24-hour-a-day corporation right now. I can take that skills and leadership and the experience of being sheriff and bring it to Washington and do something about it. Not everybody can. So really, if I don't, who? Nobody. There's nobody else that can win this seat. So would I regret if I didn't do it? The answer is yes. Yes, I would. And then the ultimate thing that made me decide was, I realized I'm pretty good at throwing rocks. I've stood up against the governor many times on initiatives. I can get in front of a camera. The media has an appetite for it here in Sacramento. I can get up and talk about what's really going on. I can talk about, I can say and articulate things in ways people can understand in a simplified way, but that's all I can do. I can stand on the outside of the ring, and I can throw rocks, and I can root for the person that's in there fighting. And ultimately, unless I'm willing to get in that ring and get my knuckles bloody, there's nothing I can do beyond that. And so I just decided that this is something that I feel like I need to do. And so I announced last November, and we've been going ever since. So that's the reason I'm running for Congress, and that's the reason that I feel compelled to run for Congress. And that's the reason we'll keep running for the next few months until November 8th, which is 116 days. So
who's counting?
Yeah. So that does, that's that. And I wanted to go back a little bit before I open up for questions and tell you about, just to kind of put on my sheriff's hat for a minute and talk about the state of public safety in California. I'd be remiss if I didn't do that, because I think public safety-wise, it's the most challenging environment in California that it's ever been in my entire career, and I would argue even before that. This push to release people early from jails and prisons, this push for mitigated and lowered accountability for offenders. You have a group of offenders that were in prison that are now out, tens of thousands of them. Now, we can argue about what the statistical recidivism rate is, but there is a recidivism rate, whether it's 70% or 60 or 50%. Those people are committing crimes at a statistical rate that would not have been able to commit crimes had it not been for Prop 47, had it not been for realignment, and all the things that you don't know about that the governor's done, like creating half-time eligibility for second strikers, like elderly parole, like women parole if they have a kid, which the men sued, so now they get it too if they have a kid. Everybody is being pushed out of jail and prisons early, and a statistical amount of those folks are committing crimes. That's why we're seeing violent crime in this state for the first time go up 11% statewide last year. That's why. We've had a couple of decade downward trend of violent crime. If you remember, for those of you that are old enough to remember, in the late 80s and early 90s, we had crime was out of control. Violent crime was out of control. So we had things like 3 strikes, gun enhancements, gang enhancements, all these things. These things worked, and it's made a downward trend of violent crime over the last 2 decades. And so people have a short memory. So they say, well, look, the downward trend of violent crime, we don't need these things anymore, without really realizing the nexus between these initiatives and the result that they've achieved. So now we're seeing the pendulum swing back fast and furious. So you have a governor's initiative now, the Public Safety and Rehabilitation Act, which is nothing more than another early release program for prison. No matter how he packages it, it will vest complete control of how and when people get out of prison with CDCR. So a judge can sentence somebody to 20 years, CDCR decides when they get out. And they get to write the regulations after it gets voted on. So you will not even know what regulations you're voting on by November. I asked the governor directly at a meeting, I said, will you at least have a framework for these regulations so people know what they're voting on? Yeah, I think we, that's my best, Jerry Brown. Yeah, I think we can do that. I can guarantee you, you're not going to see what you're voting on before that initiative gets on the ballot. So I would just ask you to get informed of all the initiatives and realize what's going on. I really think people are at their point of saturation with crime, and I think that will get loaded down. But it's going to rely on, remember how Prop 47 passed? Remember what that was called?
Safe School.
Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act. So the people that were less informed than they should have been went into the polling place and said, oh, I don't know what this is, but I want safe neighborhoods, I want safe schools, this is something I can really get behind. They voted yes for it, it passed by the voters. But I can guarantee you all those voters feel duped. So I just ask you to be informed, especially about the Public Safety and Rehabilitation Act, which has another nice name, the governor's initiative. So, all right, with that, happy to open up to questions about me, my family, the sheriff, my campaign, favorite color, doctor.
So last weekend, I took my daughter to her first movie. She's 3 years old, and we sat down. It was a happy time, happy day. Got my parents with us, my husband, my other daughter, the whole family's there. And as soon as the lights went down for the movie, I thought it was like a light bulb clicked. And I go, how are we going to get out of here if somebody comes in with a gun?
Let me ask you, who among us does not have that same thought when we go to a movie now? That we just, at least for a fleeting moment, kind of look around and say, and just have a fleeting moment about what if something happens in the movie. I know I do.
It's strange. It's bizarre because I'm not a paranoid person, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I'm a very logical, rational person. And it just was kind of this intuition I had. So I first want to thank you for making that something that you plan to take seriously. Even in Folsom, I feel like I live in a safe community and happy and all these things, but it is part of our daily lives as Americans now. So
It should be part of it.
On the other side, the question is, again, with 2 young daughters, I'm also now constantly on edge about sex trafficking. Is that something you plan to be attentive to if you were to implement this?
So 2 things. I'll start your second one first, the sex trafficking. So I have been engaged with sex trafficking task force with I have the technical on this, sex trafficking task force with the FBI right now. We have for many years. I sit on committees, and I have really promoted sex trafficking investigations. We have come up with information cards. We've educated our deputies. They'll say, you've probably heard the claim that Sacramento is one of the highest sex trafficking places. First of all, take that with a grain of salt. We do have a sex trafficking problem. I equate sex trafficking to domestic violence of 20 years ago, right? Only the big cities would acknowledge really having a problem. The little cities didn't have a problem, and it wasn't everywhere. The laws weren't really caught up to it yet, and now it is. There's an awareness, the laws are there. The same is true of sex trafficking, human trafficking of any kind right now. The laws aren't quite there yet. There's not an awareness. The small towns don't think they have a problem. The only reason we're so much a hotbed for sex trafficking is because we are engaging in it. We acknowledge it, and we're creating statistics to it. So we're generating statistics and arrests and rescues and everything else, so that makes it seem like we're this hotbed, but the reality is we're doing more than most of the other places otherwise, so we're creating the stats. But we are on a literal crossroads, right? We're on 2 nation to nation, coast to coast highways, 80 to the east and west, and on I-5 to the north and south. So that we get influences not only for gang activity, but also sex trafficking. So the legislature is kind of, there's human trafficking bills that come every year, so it's getting there. And our enforcement is certainly work as a priority for us. So let me go back to the safety that we all feel. I mentioned before that I thought immigration was going to be, back when I decided to run, and even before that I thought immigration was going to be, but as it's progressed, I believe the number one thing on people's minds is their own safety. Whether it's homeland security, whether it's domestic terror, foreign terrorism, domestic terrorism, or just crime, I just don't think, the more people I talk to, I just don't think they feel as safe as they did a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. And the problem is you have an administration that won't even acknowledge the fear, and he blames these other things. I mean, contrast this to after 9/11. And I'll use this analogy. We all felt vulnerable after 9/11. We all felt vulnerable. We got a president that got on TV, acknowledged people's fear, and came up with some decisive action on what he was going to do. Right? Now we can argue about what he did. I mean, I'm not here to subscribe to what he did or how he did or the decisions he made. I mean, that's his decision. But he acknowledged our fear and made us feel better about that. We don't have that. We don't have a president that's even acknowledging our fear. We have record gun sales in this country for the last 12 months in a row, set record for gun sales. Now why is that? You think people have this fascination with guns? You think people are worried about Obama's going to make them illegal? That may be a part of it. But that doesn't explain record gun sales month after month after month. And it can be explained by people feel vulnerable. Now you look at Maslow's hierarchy of basic needs, second from the bottom is personal safety. So before people care about global warming and they care about whatever crusades or issues that they care about, they have to feel safe going out of their house in the morning to even deal with those other issues. And people do not feel safe. And so when people don't feel safe, they have to do something to empower themselves to feel safer. And that, for many people, is buying guns. Does it make them safer? You can argue that it does or doesn't. Probably doesn't. In most cases, doesn't make them safer, but it makes them feel safer. People have to feel like they have to do something. I imagine there's people, and I won't make you raise your hand, but I imagine there's people in this group that never own guns, that either have bought a gun or have contemplated, have had a discussion in their family or with their wife or husband saying, should we get a gun, whether they did or not. And you would have never had that discussion 3 or 5 years ago because you have this sense that no one can validate the fear that we are feeling. That's my personal opinion, but it's based on, after talking to a lot of people. And obviously I'm looking from the inside out from a public safety standpoint.
So I mean, on that same topic, I have a question that has a little bit of background to it. 20 years ago, I recall when I was a kid, my mom was a teacher, and they had shooter the building drills, and she was the only teacher in her school that had all of her kids line up on the inside of the wall where the door was and hold their heaviest textbook. And if someone came through the door, she told them to throw their textbook at this person. And now I'm hearing about programs where they're teaching kids the same types of techniques. What programs do you think can make those of us that aren't feeling safe feel safe as a group of normal citizens who actually are law-abiding and just want to feel safe?
Well, first of all, there's things you should know that we train all the time. We law enforcement community. I was telling somebody before we started this meeting that myself and Chief Renaud and all the chiefs meet once a month. We have coffee, actually here in Folsom. And
Come to Argos.
what's that?
Come to Argos.
This is good. We're talking about top secret stuff there. And so we in law enforcement do training on that all the time. That doesn't necessarily make people feel better because they don't really know it, but we do training with school districts all the time. So if that happened, we're not, and having officers in the school also helps for rapid response. The other thing I can tell you that I'm doing is I realize that people need to feel empowered, just like you. There's a certain amount of helplessness, especially when you drop your kid off of school, then you relinquish control of them. And so I've done a couple of things. Number one is we created a video called Run, Hide, Fight, which is something you can do for workplace shooter violence. Right? After San Bernardino, everybody felt one. But now the odds of a workplace shooting in your place of business is extremely remote. But that doesn't mean people's fears aren't valid. People just want to feel empowered. And so we created, it's on our website, you can go take a look at it. And it's not agency specific. Run, Hide, Fight, things you can do, discussions you can have in your workplace now, in anticipation, and things that you can do during a workplace shooting incident. The other thing that I'm doing is we're creating a curriculum, an active shooter sort of curriculum about what you can do, but also about what law enforcement is going to do. we don't want to educate people that are contemplating workplace shootings, but we're going to do it where we normally do it for the law enforcement. We're changing the curriculum to be more for the general public, because I realize there's this leadership void making people feel safe. And so to the extent that I can, I'm trying to fill that void and empower people, at least with knowledge, to say, okay, well, at least I have the comfort of knowing that the agency's trained this. They may even trained at my particular school, that we have an officer on site. I know what the officers are going to do. I know the response time now is going to be between 1.5 and 3 minutes, and I know that what they're going to go through and do. Like, for example, in an active shooter, most people don't know that the wisdom kind of changes. A traditional law enforcement response is locate the threat, isolate, and evacuate. LIE, locate, isolate, evacuate. For an active shooter, it is not. So the active shooter, an officer will go straight to the threat and neutralize the threat. Neutralize the threat. So in a normal case, we don't shoot unless we're compelled to do so by the facts. In an active shooter case, we shoot unless we're compelled not to by the suspect's actions. Because we're not going to take the chance. If they're truly a moving active shooter, right? Not if they're holed up in a place like a normal person. And we will also leave injured people where they are. That first team is going to go in and neutralize that threat. Well, it's good stuff for you to know. At least you have to be empowered to know what's going to happen if something did happen. But I mean, I'd say your mom was pretty revolutionary thinking about that back in the day. I mean, when I was a kid, I grew up in LA, we had earthquake drills where we get under the table. And I think the generation before me had nuclear drills, right, where they got under the table. So, I mean, the problem is now is everybody thinks, well, this is our new reality, this is our new, I don't believe that. I don't think it has to be. And I think if we settle into that mindset, well, it's just a post 9/11 world, or these terrorist attacks, San Bernardinos, these Orlandos, these things are just going to happen now. This part of life. I don't believe that. I made the bold statement. I said I was on a radio station and they were talking about internet radicalization and joining terrorist movements, either at the direction of or inspired by ISIS. And I said, well, I can stop internet radicalization. He looked at me like, how? I said, win the war on terrorism. There's nobody that gets inspired by a sinking ship. Rats don't climb onto a sinking ship. They leave a sinking ship. If we were winning the war on terrorism, no one would be inspired to be part of something greater than themselves in a losing war. So once you start winning the war on terrorism, you will cease having people radicalized on the internet. And unless and until that happens, they're joining because they think they're joining the winning team. And by all accounts, they are winning. So, yes, sir.
So one of the concerns in France is that with the attacks on Bastille Day, they're going to extend the state of emergency in France, which are the extra powers that have been given to the police and the national security apparatus in France. Some of the concerns of some folks in France is that by extending that state of security, they're going to lose a little bit of the Republican culture in France. So what do you see as the balance between security and liberty here at home?
It's tough. I mean, it's very tough, especially for America, because we are obviously the pinnacle of personal liberties, but that has to be balanced. I mean, if you think about every inconvenience or every additional security measure, it means giving up some sort of liberty. So I guess the balance is what people are willing to tolerate to be safer. The threats are increasingly more sophisticated and they're more violent, right? So our response to them has to be as well. If I were to ask you before 9/11, hey, I'm thinking about creating a system at the airport whereby you have to take off your shoes and belt and you have to take your computer out, and we're going to create a new bureaucracy of the federal government that's going to really inconvenience you and increase your time through security. No one will be willing to tolerate that. No one will be willing to tolerate license plate readers. No one will be able to tolerate these the portable cameras that law enforcement agencies have that put in areas or special events. No one will be able to tolerate that, or posting them in a neighborhood. But now we are. We find it less objectionable because that is something, the TSA is something we're willing to accept. I mean, assuming that they can catch the threats, which there's some question as to that in different audits, but assuming that it works as anticipated, we're willing to do that because we see the threat. So, okay, that's something that we're willing to do as a people. And okay, you know what? If there's a crime spike in a certain area, I think we're willing to have a camera there, or we're willing to do license plate readers. We're willing to give law enforcement some of the tools that they need to do it. So, but it's a moving target based on what's going on in the local area and the nation and the country. But it's also one that has to be, I think, vetted with a lot of discussion, right? I normally can't make these discussions, or make these decisions for a law enforcement agency without giving a sense. So for example, I'll give you an example. We have license plate readers on almost all of our cars. So it collects as when the cars are doing their thing. They don't go looking for cars, and so it'll pop up as something stolen. Or alternatively, if we, like the gun store robbery that occurred, right? That was caught on video camera, but it could have just as easily been an LPR that caught that license plate, and we were able to identify who it was. We as Postal Police was able to go to Oakland and get the suspects who did that. And people are okay with that. So my folks said, well, this is such a successful program, I want to drive cars through high crime neighborhoods and just collect LPR data. So if we have crimes, we can find out where people were. And I said, no. I said, I have no problem putting them on patrol cars when it's in concurrence with our normal duties of going around and doing public safety, but I am unwilling to do just routine, going around for the sole purpose of collecting oodles of data. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing, the mindset, the balance that I go through, and I suspect every agency is different and goes through that same sort of analysis, but on a macro scale, that's always the balance, right? What people are willing to accept and what the law enforcement needs to keep them safe. Right now the issue is about metadata, right? What sort of metadata should we give federal agencies the ability to review? Should we be able to get a court order and get in someone's iPhone? So you're seeing these issues play out on a national scale, global scale in some cases, but it always comes down to what people are willing to accept versus what's going on in the world versus what law enforcement needs to keep them safe. The threats get increasingly more sophisticated, so must then the technology to be able to counter them. Yes?
Two-part question. First part, this day and age, it's an us versus them kind of mentality, right? It's whether it's terrorism, racism, police officers, and then even in the presidential campaign. So I'm not going to ask you who you're going to vote for or back, but in this mentality of us versus them, how do you find, at least with the sheriff's department or law enforcement in general, how do we kind of play out a whole united front versus, because I mean we were looking at the global, and that's your big thing right here is terrorism, but on a hyper local level, it's law enforcement versus everyday people.
So I first challenge that, right? I mean, that's what we're hearing, right? We hear people say us versus them, you see different movements, and you hear a lot of rhetoric on both sides. I would first challenge the premise that it's us versus them. So I would always caution you about listening to the vocal minority, and I don't mean that demographically, I mean it's a small number of people that are yelling the loudest. It's always them that seem to get the attention. We have it now. We have Black Lives Matter protests, protesting the sheriff's department on a particular shooting. But be careful about letting them create the narrative. I mean, I bet no one in here feels like it's us versus them for law enforcement. In my experience, and I have the benefit, I get to talk to groups like this. My officers don't have that benefit. They deal with people that sometimes don't like them because they're doing things that they don't like. The cops take them to jail. But I get to talk to groups like this. It is not us versus them. I mean, I can't tell you over the protests over the last week how many cookies and candy and flowers and emails that we've gotten in our department that says, hey, this is not the narrative. The narrative, it's my words, not theirs, but that's not the narrative. The narrative is we have great law enforcement and there's a tremendous appreciation locally, regionally, for law enforcement. So don't believe so much about, you have to realize the B and the video media, their job is to sell advertising. That is their function. The more viewership share they have, the more they can charge for their advertising. So that's why no good stories ever get on the news. That doesn't sell. Blood and guts and controversy and sexiness, all that sells, increases market share. So that's what they're going to cover. And so they're always going to cover these controversies. So you have, but it always falls away in the light of statistics. But they won't ever publish them. Report on the statistics. So I would just stay firm with what you believe and realize that what you all feel about law enforcement and about us versus them is what 90% of the country feels that way. Don't let the vocal minority create the narrative.
And then my second question is, if you weren't in law enforcement, what would you be doing?
Well, I do work in law enforcement. So.
No, if you weren't in law
enforcement.
enforcement.
If I weren't in law enforcement? I don't know. I'll tell you a quick story, just because you're all business folk. The only reason I'm in Sacramento is because my dad, who was a vice president and general manager of an HVAC, heating and air conditioning manufacturing in LA, wanted to start his own business as a rep, a manufacturer's rep for that industry. All the construction was going on in Sacramento. So we moved up in 1980. I was 12 years old, And he started his own business. It was awful. It was. I mean, we went without new school clothes, and went without going to the dentist. I'm sorry. We did many, you know, it's not an uncommon, I mean, those of you that have your own business, it's not an uncommon, you know, an uncommon series of events. But I'm the first one in my family to go into public service. You know, so I've you know, been with the county the whole time, but I'm the only one in my family. So my nightly dinner conversations were about regulation and over-regulation and taxation and all these things that inhibit business. So my sense is, and he asked me, he said, do you want to go into family business? Selling air conditioners, gunfights and car chases. Sorry, Dad. So my oldest brother now runs the business, and they're doing okay now. But so it's hard to say. I mean, I'm also a lawyer, so I went to law school. So when I was young,
You're just born to fight, basically.
I was a
You born to fight.
You sound like my mom. I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer, a cop, or a doctor. So I actually went to UC Davis to become a doctor out of high school. So physics, calculus, chemistry, all that stuff. I loved it. And then after a couple of years, for some reason, I decided to be a cop, transferred to Sac State, finished my degree in criminal justice. When I was a deputy in the jail, I went to law school at night, so the only one left I have to do is
Actually be a doctor.
to be a doctor. So when I retire, I'll go to med school. So I don't know, maybe a lawyer, maybe in business somewhere, but I don't know, it's hard to say. This has been a pretty good job.
Get into deep when you can't even like think about the alternative at some point, right?
I've never, I mean, I tell you, it's the best job in the world. If it's a life well lived. I've never called in sick because I didn't feel like going to work. It's something different. It's just entertainment to me. I love it. I love the job. And you know, you don't know that going into it, but as you start getting closer to retirement than the start of your career, you look back and you think how, you know, I really appreciate how blessed I have been to have spent this career well. Yes, sir.
Two things. First, a comment that in Folsom, I agree with you 100%. I don't think that we feel it's an us versus them mentality, as evident by a few days ago. We had a pretty large group of residents all organized on Facebook, post themselves all around town with signs saying we love the Folsom PD and thank you for keeping us safe. And I thought
Song over the freeway.
It was really, really a cool thing because we don't see that today, and we don't understand that people are here to protect us. The second thing is what does the average citizen do to really get back and try to repeal Prop 47 and the things that are making, you know, carrying around heavy narcotics in this community, or smashing rats in this community, or all of those things. So they talk about we don't have the money to put people back in jail, and we don't have the feds are saying our jails are overcrowded. I mean, is building more jails the answer? Is you know, where do we go?
Well, that is an interim solution, but the fact remains is we do incarcerate too many people. I mean, we in America incarcerate a much higher percentage of people than the rest of the world. So the easy answer, right, the politically expedient answer is, well, we'll just let more people out. That is not the answer. You have to really look at the causation of why people go into jail. We talk about the misrepresentation of our different communities of color in prison. That's an absolute truth. So it's easy to say, well, then we need to, it's easy to conclude, well, the system must be biased. But it's a lot more politically difficult, but it will be a lot more effective when we actually have the difficult discussions about why it is there's a disproportionality in our different communities, why there's an economic disparity, why there's an education gap, why these things exist. Only unless and until you look at those causative factors, then you are never going to solve that disproportionality in our prisons, and you're never going to prevent it. Right now, since I've been sheriff, I created a youth services unit, right? It's the first time we've ever had it in 150 years. I have dedicated deputies and that do nothing but youth services. We touch thousands of young people in this county every week. Friday night basketball, we have girls circle, we do leadership academies in schools. That's a long-term strategy, right? Because we were always good at picking people off the top, but we were never good at keeping them from going in the bottom. So now, we will. I mean, we have people not only talking about, for the first time in their lives, a career in law enforcement, but we have people that we're not showing up in their lives only to do bad things. We're showing up to do good things, and they have a more balanced appreciation or at least understanding of what cops do. And that's a long-term strategy, but that's something we're doing for the long term as a causative factor. But unless the politicians are willing to talk about it and have those difficult discussions, which it doesn't seem like they are, then nothing's going to change. So they'll have to keep letting people out of jail. There's only two ways to reduce prison population: close the front door, which is realignment, or open the back door, which is everything since. And that's what they've done, without any regard to who should be getting it.
Does Sacramento County or any of our regional areas, do we offer any type of a scared straight program or anything, and do those work in capacity?
Statistically, they don't work. And they make for interesting TV, but statistically, when they follow it, it just doesn't work. We do, part of our youth services, we do bring people to Folsom Prison, but it's not a scared straight. It's more of a sit down with participants in Folsom Prison that want to help kids, and it's more of a discussion. It's more of a, hey, don't make the same mistakes I did. It's not a scared straight. And that's pretty effective. It's just, normal folks talking to me that they can relate to. And as far as Prop 47, does everybody know what Prop 47 did? It did a number of things, but the main thing it did is create a bunch of felonies and made them misdemeanors. So now things like theft of a firearm, possession of any amount of any drug, all that's now a misdemeanor. So I give the examples: if you run into a gun store, steal a gun, run out to the arms of a waiting Folsom PD officer, because they catch everybody, and what have you committed? It would have been 2 felonies: business burglary, commercial burglary, and theft of a firearm, 2 felonies. Well, now they're misdemeanors. So now you get a citation. Well, that's like a traffic ticket, promise to appear. So you get a court date, you decide not to show up for that court date, you get a warrant. A misdemeanor, failure to appear warrant, FTA, failure to appear warrant. So there's been nothing to dissuade him from his criminal behavior, so he continues to do that and gets 5 failure to appear warrants. So finally, and by the way, the law doesn't allow me to take someone to jail for a misdemeanor unless they meet certain criteria. One of those criteria is the likelihood they won't show up for court. So on the 6th time, Folsom PD officer says, I think there's a likelihood you won't show up for court, because you have 5 failure to appear warrants. I'm going to take you to jail. They take him to my jail, because everyone goes to my jail. And what do we do with him? Well, first of all, let me tell you about the warrants. So you may think, okay, well, he's got warrants now, so he's going to be only coming out at night. He's always going to be looking over his shoulder. The police are going to be going knocking on his door. In Sacramento County, we have almost 68,000 misdemeanor FTA warrants in the system. 68,000. I'm not looking for them. Folsom PD is not looking for them. If we have time to look for warrants, then we're looking for these 7,000 or 8,000 felony FTA warrants that are in the system. Makes sense, right, from a triage perspective. So this officer finally brings in with the sixth fresh misdemeanor arrest and 5 FTA warrants. What do I do with them? Well, because of all this other stuff, I have no room in my jail. So I clear out his warrants, issue him a new court date, and send him out the front door. So what is the likelihood he's going to show up for that court date? So they're not being held accountable at all, which is why we're seeing property crime go through the roof. Because they know. And now the grand theft, the misdemeanor to felony threshold is $950, which covers most handguns. So you asked about how do we alleviate this. All this stuff was to regulate prison population. No matter what they couch it as, it's all to regulate prison population. Make no mistake about it. So they knew what they were doing. So to make it better for public safety, in other words, to reduce the effects of Prop 47, requires a vote of the people, requires an initiative. But to make it worse for public safety, to add more felonies that can now be misdemeanors, only requires legislative action. So if the population still increases, they can just add a few more felonies that are now misdemeanors by legislation. But to make it better for it, it has to be an initiative, which means the legislature has to vote to put it on the ballot, or, which they will not do, not in this culture, or you have to go through a very expensive, multi-million-dollar process for us to get it on the ballot. There's been attempts every legislative session. I know Jim Cooper tried to get where theft of a firearm is a felony. It never makes it out of committee. The governor just vetoed that bill. It's on his desk. While he signed a bill outlawing assault weapons and making you register for ammo and everything else, the very same day he vetoed that bill. There's been attempts to try and make us able to collect DNA for those felonies that are now misdemeanors, because we can collect DNA on felony arrests, and we solved a lot of crimes with DNA, and we exonerate a lot of people with DNA. That never made it out of committee. To try and make possession of date rape drugs, right? The advocates for drug advocates will say, well, but for their addiction, they wouldn't be outlaws. Okay, well, I can tell you, no one's addicted to date rape drugs. If they have a backpack full of date rape drugs, they're not addicted, they're looking to victimize people. So there was an effort to try and make date rape drug a felony. That failed as well. So in this political climate, nothing's going to change. And none of us are going to be able to put it on the ballot. So I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I do. And people have different points of saturation. I'm already past it, but I'm a lot more involved, and I'm in the know, and I'm also, I see the effects of this in terms of the effect on public safety. People have different points of saturation. I believe that most people are there, and I believe that's why I believe the governor's initiative will fail. I could be wrong.
Yeah, so kind of probably one more question.
So on the subject of actually, kind of trusting the police, and there's been bad decisions made recently on all accounts. when I lived in Houston, there was a big concern that the gangs there had figured out that if they put their people into the military, then they would be military trained, and strategically any gang violence had that military strategy. And when I heard the Dallas PD say, hey guys, we're hiring, that was immediately my first thought. If I was the head of a gang, I'd be like, that's a freaking great idea. If the Crips ran the police department or whatever.
That's true. A couple of things. Number one, criminals are two things, lazy and stupid. Generally. I'm making a generalization. I mean, that's why if you put a camera in front of your house, your odds of getting burglarized are far less. Even if it's a fake camera. Because they'll see it and think, this guy doesn't have a camera. So, number one, that requires a lot of initiative. And if someone had that much initiative to invest, a year-long process to further their criminal enterprise, chances are they're not going to be criminals in the first place, right? If someone had that much gumption to be able to do that. But that's not to say it couldn't happen. I mean, you look at the guy, the Dallas shooter. I mean, he was military trained. He was in the reserves or something. He was military trained. We look at some of these others that have military training. So then it becomes a question of vetting, right? The vetting of officers, psychological testing, we look at social media and all that stuff. You would have to be very smart, very cunning to be able to sneak through all the vetting that goes into law enforcement. Law enforcement are vetted as much or more than any other profession in this country. And so we can usually catch that stuff, whether it's social media, talking to the neighbors, talking to teachers, and we do all that stuff. So we do a pretty robust vetting as all law enforcement does. So to say it couldn't happen would be naive, because it could happen. My sense is that most of the people that have military training that go bad, that usually happens after they get it. Right? So even this guy was probably gung-ho to go in the military. By all accounts, when he was in high school, he always wanted to go in the military. But my guess is his dissatisfaction, the discord that caused him to make those shootings, happened after. And I suspect it's the same thing too with officers. I mean, sometimes we can get officers that have character flaws, deep character flaws. It might not manifest itself for 5 or 10 years. And then they get tempted and they steal something, or they use drugs or whatever. I've fired over 40 deputies since I've been sheriff. So 5 or 6 years. Now we're a very large agency. We're the 7th largest sheriff firm in the country. We have about 1,500 officers. So it's proportionate, I think, to most. But I've fired over 40, about one every other month. I'm firing, and they all deserve it. But those are people who made it through. Nothing as terrible as obviously what we've seen, but they made it through this vetting process. And that's the other part. Once we start to see early warning signs or other issues that are red flags to us, it's up to us to take appropriate action. And I know everybody in the region does, and I think in California generally. So, well, again, I'll end where I started. Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity. I know we're a little late, but thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming out. I did want to leave a little bit of time. I just want to do a quick little shout out for volunteers.
Yeah, so I touched on it earlier, but just to kind of touch base about Tap Wholesome, it's our craft brew fest that the chamber supports, puts on. It is always nice to have these lots of great people come to the line, so it's actually you're networking while you're pouring, which is really fun. You can volunteer to set up or clean up, or bring people out, promote it on social media. There's all kinds of ways to support these things, so please do so. And again, let us know if you want to help with any of those things.
And then Megan, Sharon, do you guys have any other chamber news that you want to talk about real quick?
Which one? Oh, yes, we have a tap mixer next Tuesday at Total Wine and More, another fabulous member of ours. So in the back room, if you walk in, we're going to be doing a bunch of beer tastings from breweries that are going to be represented at Tap Wholesome. So come out, support, Costa Vida. Another great member is going to be catering the entire event. And Sheriff Thomas, you are more than welcome to attend. I actually wanted to ask you, what's your favorite beer? Because that's what I'm going to judge you on.
That's what I need to be seen as surrounded by beer.
But come on.
If we have one in November, I'll go.
Right. Okay. Oh, after you're elected.
Yes.
Okay. Because they can't do anything then, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Come on, everyone loves Bush. You could go grab a beer with that guy, right?
Yeah.
Whether you like him or hate him, grab a beer.
That's true. No one wants to see their sheriff drinking though.
Unless you're Ubering there, it's fine. Tap Wholesome. So yes, Tap Wholesome mixer next Tuesday. Please come out and support. We're trying to get as much support around this event as possible. We're a little slow on the upswing. So really needing you guys to help advocate for this, because I know we came off rodeo and we're feeling great about that, and we're going to be right into Folsom Live. So don't forget about this event. It's my favorite event.
And then one more thing, the next Junior Friday, we will be having actually August 5th. It'll be a little bit of a short time here just due to the holidays and everything like that. So August 5th, location is still to be determined. It actually might end up being here again. We do have Ami Barra coming out for that meeting, and would love to have you guys back out for that. So thank you guys for coming. Stay, mingle, hang out, have more coffee. Thanks.
How are you? All right, I'll talk to you later.